8-second hook, voice low, deliberate, cinematic. They say Texas soil remembers, that the blood you bury in it doesn't fade, it ferments. That if you dig deep enough, beneath the clay and the pine roots, you'll find ledgers that were never meant to be read, and a name they tried to erase with fire and silence. Samuel Kincaid, the man every plantation feared to own, because every man who bought him died. Not by blade, not by poison, but by something far more precise, something that understood the mind, the body, and the arrogance of men who believed they owned another human soul. When historians talk about slavery, they focus on cruelty and endurance. But buried beneath those words lies a darker arithmetic, the economy of control. The plantation wasn't just a business, it was a laboratory. Every rule, every lash, every prayer was an experiment in domination. And somewhere inside that machine, one man learned the formula well enough to turn it against its master. Samuel didn't fight. He observed. He listened when others screamed. He noticed what broke men, not their bones, but their certainty. His rebellion wasn't fire, it was calculation. He learned the rhythms of power, the fragile routines of those who commanded him, the precise moments when they mistook comfort for safety. Every plantation he entered followed the same ritual, a purchase, a signature, a new beginning. And every one of those beginnings ended with a coffin. The county called it coincidence. The doctors called it failure of constitution. But the enslaved called it justice disguised as sickness. They whispered his name like a prayer that could slip through locked doors. Samuel, the one who kills without killing. The shadow that never runs. But what if I told you this story isn't just about vengeance? What if it's about something deeper, something designed, not by chance, but by understanding how obedience really works? Because the plantation wasn't only a place of chains, it was a prototype for Before Samuel Kincaid became the ghost in the ledgers, he was just another body in the trade, born somewhere between memory and paperwork. His records list 3 different birthplaces: Virginia, Mississippi, and New Orleans. That wasn't an error. It was a design. Dealers falsified origins to erase stories, to unmake men before they were sold. But in Samuel's case, that erasure hid something else. Something deliberate. He was trained, though no one could later say by whom. Somewhere along the river routes between Natchez and New Orleans, he'd learned to read the silence of men. Not words, not letters, silence. The kind that dripped from the overseer's mouth when he lied. The pause between orders when fear flickered behind authority. Samuel could map a man's weakness just by how long he chewed his food. When he arrived in Marshall, Texas, the system didn't see a man, it saw inventory. Lot number 7, $420. No distinguishing marks. But what the auctioneer missed was the stillness. Samuel didn't flinch when examined, didn't blink at the humiliation. Stillness unnerves predators. It confuses them. The human mind expects motion, reaction, submission. Samuel gave them nothing. He was an empty mirror, forcing each man to see only himself. Thomas Caffrey, his first master, prided himself on reason. Moderate, disciplined, God-fearing. One of those men who mistook their restraint for righteousness. But reason is brittle. It cracks under its own certainty. Within weeks, Samuel had mapped Caffrey's schedule, his sickness, his solitude, the headaches, the laudanum, the daughter who mixed the dose. When Caffrey died in his sleep that summer, the county physician called it apoplexy, a sudden failure of the body. No wounds, no signs of poison, just silence. But look closer. Every detail of that night, the unwashed glass, the measured dose, the timing, suggests something too precise to be random. Samuel never touched the medicine. He never had to. Influence doesn't always. Robert Chandler believed himself immune to superstition. He was a man of ledgers and measurements, a deacon who tithed precisely 10%, who spoke of slavery not as cruelty, but as God's natural hierarchy. His plantation operated like a clock wound by profit and prayer. Every minute accounted for, every mouth fed by ration, every punishment tallied in ink. Order, control, efficiency. These were the pillars of his world. When Samuel Kincaid arrived at his gates, that clock began to die, quietly, gear by gear. Chandler didn't notice at first. None of them did. Samuel moved like shadow, neither idle nor eager, the kind of worker that draws no attention. But in the stillness of Texas nights, when the cicadas paused and the world seemed to hold its breath, people began to whisper. Dogs barked without reason. The air in Chandler's study grew heavy, metallic, like the scent before lightning. Samuel watched him, the posture of a man before prayer, the tremor when his stomach seized, the habit of taking his mercury pills without question. Calomel, the white cure. Every plantation owner used it. Every doctor prescribed it. They said it cleansed the body. What it really did was eat it from the inside out. And Samuel understood that truth better than any physician. He didn't need to add poison. He only needed to remind Chandler to take what he already trusted. "Mosses say medicine keep you strong?" Samuel asked one evening while polishing silver in the hallway. Chandler smiled, proud of his modern remedies. "Yes, boy. Calomel keeps a man's humors balanced." Samuel nodded slowly. Maybe that's why others get sick. They stopped talking it, and that was all it took. A seed of pride wrapped in obedience. Chandler doubled his dosage the next night. Within days, his color faded, his eyes yellowed, and his stomach began to rot from within. When the doctor arrived, he blamed God again. "Failure of constitution," he wrote. The system's favorite phrase for mysteries it dared not know. Daniel Hartford considered himself a righteous man, the kind who wore scripture like armor. He began every morning with a psalm and every whipping with a prayer. His plantation was cleaner, quieter, more civilized than others. He called it the Lord's order, and the slaves called it hell in a hymn. Because Hartford's kindness wasn't mercy, it was control disguised as morality. He believed that if they sang loud enough, God would forgive the chains that bound them. When Samuel arrived, Hartford saw not a threat, but a test, a chance to prove his divine discernment. A troubled soul, he called him, one who needs guiding light. What he didn't realize was that Samuel had already studied that light and learned how to snuff it out from inside. The gin was the heart of Hartford's operation, the place where cotton turned into cash and men turned into dust. Samuel was placed there close enough to watch the overseer, the equipment, the entire ecosystem of obedience. He learned the rhythm of the workday, the prayers before meals, the verses recited before punishment. He noticed who bowed too quickly and who hesitated just long enough to reveal thought. But what caught his attention most wasn't the overseer, it was the woman in the kitchen. Rachel. Rachel was quiet, methodical, invisible, exactly how Hartford liked his household staff. She'd been cooking his meals for over a decade. She knew his body better than his wife did. What foods soothed him, what spices irritated him, what doses of tonic calmed his stomach. When Samuel offered to help her in the kitchen garden, she didn't protest. She just watched him, the way prey studies something that might be hunting it. They never spoke directly about Hartford, but Samuel's questions were surgical. "Why do you grow foxglove here? Who taught you to dry the leaves?" Rachel's hands had trembled once, just once, when he asked about the herb shelf behind the kitchen door. "Some plants," she whispered. "You don't touch. Why?" James Whitlock was not like the others. He was younger, sharper, a man raised in the shadow of ruin. His father had died in debt, his mother in silence, and every dollar he owned came from buying what others feared. So when the rumor of a cursed slave reached him, he didn't recoil. He smiled. "If the devil's in him," Whitlock said, "then I'll make the devil work." He bought Samuel at a discount, a bargain for what he believed was mere superstition. Whitlock didn't believe in ghosts, only leverage. He saw Samuel not as a danger, but as a puzzle, a creature to be understood, controlled, and weaponized. From the first day, he tested him, watched how Samuel reacted to cruelty, to kindness, to isolation. He changed his food, his work hours, the men who guarded him. And every time, Samuel adjusted, perfectly, silently, as though he'd already rehearsed each variation in his mind. Whitlock began to keep a ledger not of cotton, but of Samuel's behavior. Entry 7. Subject appears unaffected by hunger. Entry 9. Subject maintains steady breathing even under threat. Entry 11. Eyes unnerving. No fear, only assessment. At night, Whitlock studied him from the porch, a white silhouette framed by lantern light, watching the dark shape in the fields. The other slaves whispered that Whitlock was the one being owned now by curiosity. But curiosity, like rot, starts invisible. Whitlock's obsession grew with every unanswered question. He began reading phrenology charts, occult tracts, even old plantation diaries from Louisiana that spoke of men without souls. He convinced himself that Samuel was some remnant of an older power, something ancient and patient that the Atlantic had failed to drown. He locked Samuel in the smokehouse for 3 days without food or light. When he opened the door, Samuel stood there, calm, upright, eyes reflecting the lantern like a cat's. "What are you?" Whitlock whispered. Samuel only said, "You the one that called me, ain't you?" WHI. They said he wasn't a real doctor, not the kind who healed. His name was Dr. Silas Mortcombe, a physician from Galveston with a peculiar obsession, the mechanics of obedience. He'd worked on plantations before, studying fatigue, resistance, the breaking point of the human will. Some whispered he'd once served as a Confederate medic. Others said he came from Europe, bringing with him instruments that no one could name. When he bought Samuel Conincade, it wasn't for labor. It was for study. Mortcombe's estate wasn't a farm. It was a laboratory wrapped in cotton and deceit. Slaves didn't plow there. They were measured. Their heartbeats timed. Their pupils studied under lamplight. The doctor believed that fear itself could be quantified, that if you could find the exact pulse, breath, and chemical of submission, you could design obedience. He called it behavioral theology, a fusion of science and scripture meant to justify the chains. Samuel was his prize subject. He was placed in a separate cabin under constant observation. Mortcombe filled pages about him, about his refusal to panic, about his unnaturally slow breathing during stress. "It is as if," the doctor wrote, "the body no longer receives commands from fear." But Samuel wasn't just enduring. He was watching. Every note, every measurement, every routine was a window into his captor's mind. Mortcombe believed control was a science. Samuel understood it was a story, one that only works if people believe it. Weeks passed. Assistants began reporting strange phenomena. Oil lamps flickering when Samuel entered a room, animals refusing to approach his cabin, the doctor speaking to himself late into the night. Then came the dreams. Mortcombe began recording them. Visions of fire, of voices speaking through Samuel in languages no one could name. He wrote that he awoke one night to find Samuel standing silently in the doorway, staring at him as if waiting for a command he hadn't given. The next morning, Reverend Elijah Reese was known across East Texas as the man who could drive out demons. He wore black even in summer, carried a silver crucifix, and spoke with the certainty of a man who believed he was chosen. The people came to his revivals for salvation, but stayed for the spectacle. He would shout, tremble, lay his hands upon the sick, and they would convulse like puppets cut from their strings. He called it deliverance. The town called it power. When he heard about Samuel Conincade, he declared it his divine duty to cleanse him. "The devils walked too long in human flesh," he preached, "and I shall make him speak." The crowd roared, half in fear, half in hunger for something holy. Samuel was brought to the chapel in chains. The air inside smelled of old wood, candle smoke, and desperation. The congregation filled every pew, whispering prayers that sounded more like gossip. Reverend Reese stood over him, Bible in hand, face slick with sweat. "What's your name, spirit?" he demanded. Samuel looked up, unblinking. "Same as you gave me." The Reverend's lips twitched. He began the ritual, Latin mixed with fury, his voice booming, echoing through the rafters. The candles flickered. The crowd held their breath. And then, Samuel spoke again, softly, almost kindly. "You look scared, preacher." The Reverend froze. The words shouldn't have hit so deep, but they did. Because beneath the robe, beneath the scripture, Elijah Reese was afraid of losing the one thing that made him matter: control. Samuel saw it instantly. He leaned forward, whispering just loud enough for the Reverend to hear. "What if he don't talk back to you no more?" Reese staggered, dropping his Bible. The congregation gasped. The air thickened. He screamed louder, prayed harder, desperate to drown the whisper. But the louder he shouted, the quieter Samuel became, until silence swallowed everything. When a light returned, the Reverend was on the floor, trembling. He claimed he saw visions. The Huntsville work camp wasn't a plantation. It was a graveyard that forgot to finish its job. Iron fences, swamps thick as tar, and a silence that never slept. It was where men went to vanish, their names reduced to numbers scratched into wood. The guards didn't bother with whips. Hunger and exhaustion did their work faster. When Samuel Conincade arrived, the others didn't look at him. They'd heard the stories. The man who broke masters without lifting a hand. The man whose silence made white men lose their minds. They didn't know if he was a savior or a curse. And in a place like Huntsville, sometimes those two things were the same. The warden, Captain Abram Dulles, was a cruel man by necessity, or so he told himself. He believed fear was efficiency. He believed pain was order. He kept a brass pocket watch and prided himself on never missing a beat. Every lash, every meal, every hanging time to the second. A camp is only as strong as the fear it feeds on, he liked to say. Samuel listened to that, and then he began feeding the wrong fear. He started with the prisoners, small things at first. When a man was beaten, Samuel told him not to curse, not to scream. "Let him wonder why you quiet," he whispered. "Noise feeds him. Silence confuses him." Soon, every time Dulles ordered punishment, the yard stayed still. No screams, no begging, just eyes, watching, waiting. That silence spread like infection. The guard began to talk less, to glance over their shoulders at night. Tools went missing, lamps dimmed. Rumors grew of Samuel standing in the yard under a blood moon, unmoving, as if waiting for something. Dulles couldn't stand it. He doubled the rations of punishment. But the more he whipped, the quieter it got. One morning, he found a phrase carved into the wall of his quarters. "Heard your watch stop last night." He checked. It had. Sleep left him. He started drinking before dawn, his hands trembling. The tick of the clock now a threat instead of co. They said his name in whispers now, not as gossip, but as protection. In the months after the Huntsville fire, stories spread like wind through cane fields and churchyards. Some called him the Smoke Man. Others said the Still One. But everyone knew who they meant. The slave who never screamed, who never ran, who made the men in power go mad one by one. In Marshall, overseers locked their cabins from the inside. In Galveston, a planter shot his own reflection, thinking he saw someone standing behind him. Entire families abandoned estates overnight, claiming they'd heard footsteps that stopped when they prayed. And in every version of the tale, Samuel Conincade appeared differently. Sometimes a man, sometimes a shadow, sometimes a face glimpsed in the glass just before something broke. The white men told each other it was superstition, mass hysteria, Negro tales meant to frighten children. But even as they dismissed it, they began to act strange. Letters from that time, the few that survived, reveal the unraveling. "I dream of him every night," one planter wrote. "I hear no sound, yet feel watched." Another confessed, "It's not him I fear, it's the silence he leaves behind." And beneath those letters, between the lines of official record, something else began happening. The enslaved stopped fearing the lash. They began to meet after dark, not to pray for deliverance, but to wait. Because the myth had changed. Samuel was no longer just a man. He was a signal. The moment quiet fell over a field, men would straighten their backs, eyes fixed on the horizon. When the wind stopped, when even the crickets fell still, they whispered, "He's near." Owners began arming themselves at night. Patrols tripled. Churches held sermons on the dangers of rebellion. But it was too late. Fear had crossed the color line, and the powerful were the ones now choking on it. In one plantation near Tyler, the master woke to find every tool lined perfectly at his doorstep, each blad. By the winter of 1859, the fear had grown too large to ignore. Something was happening across Texas. Something not written in the newspapers, but whispered in the corridors of the powerful. Plantation output had dropped by nearly a third. Overseers refused to work nights. Patrols quit without warning. And yet, no rebellion had been seen, no uprising shouted, no blood spilled. Just quiet. The planters called it the Canoncade Panic. One meeting was held in secret, in the basement of a Baptist church in Nacogdoches. The attendees included sheriffs, preachers, and government men who claimed to serve the stability of the South. They gathered by candlelight, their voices low, each afraid to say the name too loudly. A sheriff from Marshall spoke first. "It ain't what he did," he said. "It's what they think he can do. That's worse than guns." The Reverend Macklin nodded gravely. "A ghost can't be lynched," he said. "But belief can be managed. The devil works in symbols. So must we." That night, a plan was born, not to capture Samuel Canoncade, but to replace him. They would build a counterlegend, something louder, brighter, and more useful. A new fear, one that could bring the old order back under control. They called it Project Deliverance. The plan was simple and obscene. Ministers would preach of a false Canoncade, a demon, not a man. Broadsides would be printed describing his unnatural powers and his punishment by holy fire. The story would say he had been caught and burned alive in Huntsville's ruins, his ashes scattered by men of God. It was propaganda, born before the word existed. But propaganda requires ritual to survive, and so the church created one. Every year on the anniversary of the Huntsville fire, they would hold the Night of Cleansing, a ceremony where planters gathered to burn effigies made of straw and tar, whispering prayers not to God, but to their own guilt. But myths are like rivers. You can redirect them, but never stop the. By 1863, the war had turned America into a graveyard that forgot its own prayers. Smoke rose over cotton fields now soaked in blood instead of sweat. Men who once traded slaves now traded bullets, fighting for a dream already rotting. And amid that ruin, the name Samuel Canoncade returned, not as rumor, but as presence. It began with soldiers stationed near the Sabine River. The 7th Texas Infantry reported strange silences before ambushes, entire forests going mute. No birds, no crickets, not even the wind. Then at dawn, they'd find their sentries dead at their posts, eyes open, rifles unfired, faces twisted not in pain but in recognition. The survivors called it the Still One. Union soldiers began whispering the same name months later, though they'd never met their Confederate counterparts. At Shiloh, a corporal swore he saw a dark figure standing unburned in the middle of a cannon blast. At Vicksburg, a surgeon refused to enter his tent after finding every scalpel laid in a perfect circle, sharp ends pointing outward, initials SC etched into the ground with surgical precision. The war was madness enough, but these stories carried a different kind of dread. They weren't about death, they were about judgment. Men on both sides started writing home about a silent man walking through fire. Commanders ordered silence on the matter, fearing panic. But silence only fertilized the myth. Soon, the tale crossed enemy lines. Campfires burned lower when his name was mentioned. Some swore Samuel was God's punishment, a soul too wrong to rest. Others believed he was something older, a spirit that had worn many faces through many centuries, simply borrowing Samuel's to finish an ancient correction. In 1864, a Union chaplain named Ezra Pike documented a strange occurrence near Corinth, Mississippi. He claimed that, the night before a major skirmish, a freedman approached his camp and warned him to listen to the quiet. The chaplain awoke at midnight to a sigh. Reconstruction was supposed to rebuild the South, brick by brick, debt by debt, chain by chain, now metaphorical but no less binding. Yet wherever money flowed, wherever men tried to reclaim authority, the legend of Samuel Canoncade slipped through the cracks. Secret societies formed, cloaked in fraternal rituals and church connections. Men called themselves the Order of the Southern Cross, the Guardians of Cotton, even the Redeemers of the Lost Cause. Their mission: suppress the whispers, erase the story, and reclaim obedience to the plantations, to the courts, to the very land itself. They began by gathering every record of Samuel: bills of sale, death certificates, prison logs, even letters from soldiers claiming his presence on battlefields. Everything was collected, cataloged, and then locked in steel vaults buried beneath town halls, courthouses, and private libraries. By the late 1870s, the South had risen again, superficially. Railroads snaked across the plains, banks had reopened, and courts issued rulings that attempted to cement the old hierarchy under new laws. But the people who built these institutions felt it first in their bones, then in their minds. Something was watching. Not from the shadows, not from the heavens, but inside the system itself. Samuel Connecade had vanished from the visible world, but he had learned a lesson few men ever do. You don't need to lift a hand to control a man. You only need to teach him fear of himself. Letters arrived at banks and signed. Ledgers balanced themselves overnight, only to reveal impossible debts the next day. Shipments of cotton were found mysteriously rerouted, appearing at auctions too late to sell. Politicians who had once ruled through intimidation now faced threats that couldn't be traced, lawsuits that appeared overnight, and whispers in every council room. We see you. We know you. No one could explain it. And the more they tried, the more they stumbled. Merchants lost fortunes. Judges resigned without explanation. Clergymen preached, but their congregations left early, muttering about a presence that listened when no one else did. Samuel had become an architect of chaos, a ghost embedded in bureaucracy. He didn't need violence. He didn't need fire. He needed only the illusion of omnipresence, the knowledge that authority is fragile if those who wield it fear their own choices. In Houston, a banker found that his safe had been emptied overnight, though every door was locked, every guard accounted for. In Austin, a politician discovered that the state ledgers had been rewritten, showing land ownership in names that didn't exist. And in every instance, the phrase appeared somewhere nearby, often carved in pencil or scratched into wood. I remember. The people of the South called these events accidents, coincidences, misfortune. Some called them divine judgment. By the early 1880s, whispers of Samuel Connecade had crossed rivers, railways, and borders. Texas was no longer the limit of his shadow. Northern cities, booming with industry, railroads, and the promise of wealth, began reporting impossible anomalies. Banks balancing themselves incorrectly, shipments of coal or cotton arriving in the wrong hands, sudden deaths of businessmen with no apparent cause, and managers breaking down in offices they had controlled for decades. Philadelphia, New York, and Chicago. The story spread, thin at first, dismissed as coincidence or superstition. But the pattern was unmistakable. Wherever ambition and authority concentrated, the invisible hand moved, silently, like smoke filling a room. Ledgers shifted. Contracts rewrote themselves overnight. Men who once believed themselves untouchable were found dead in their beds, offices, or factories, with notes left behind in perfect script. I watched you fail. Industrialists spoke quietly of the still one, the shadow in the boardroom, the ghost who undermined the powerful without stepping into the light. Investors in rail lines, shipping companies, and emerging financial markets grew paranoid. Partnerships dissolved for no reason. Debts multiplied in impossibly precise ways, and men accused each other of sabotage, never realizing the threat came not from rivals, but from someone or something who had never been seen. It wasn't supernatural in the traditional sense. Samuel Connecade didn't appear in flames or smoke. He appeared as the consequences of knowledge too perfect, of observation too precise, of timing too uncanny. Every step, every decision, every man's arrogance became a vulnerability Samuel quietly exploited. By 1885, a letter from a Wall Street broker described a phenomenon that would haunt historians for decades. It is not that we fear him. We fear ourselves. Our own greed, our own mistakes, our own habits betray us. And yet, in some dark knowledge, I know he watched. By the end of the 1880s, the fear had taken form. Lawmen whispered his name between clenched teeth, politicians avoided saying it altogether, and even secret societies, the very ones that once hunted him, began mimicking his methods. What had started as revenge had turned into replication. Samuel Conincade had become a philosophy of infiltration. Every institution that tried to capture him found itself infected instead. Police records vanished, replaced by blank pages. Witnesses who swore they'd seen him woke the next morning unable to recall faces, names, even days. Court clerks found evidence rewritten in their own handwriting, perfectly legal documents that exonerated men who'd never even been on trial. And at the heart of it all, an idea began to spread. What if he never existed? The theory took hold among academics, journalists, and preachers. They said Samuel Conincade was a metaphor, a story the freedmen had told to keep hope alive, a legend the guilty retold to explain their fear. He's just guilt given form, they wrote, a myth to punish the oppressors. But the men who knew, those who'd seen the patterns, the vanishings, the inexplicable precision, said otherwise. They said Samuel was more than a man or a myth. He was a mirror, and once you saw yourself inside it, you couldn't unsee what you were built upon. Local governments began collapsing under the weight of paranoia. Mayors resigned mid-speech. Sheriffs disappeared from their own jails. Reports surfaced of entire town councils emptying overnight, their chambers left spotless except for one sentence written on the walls, always the same. You still think you're the master. Even the secret societies that once plotted against him fractured. The Order of the Southern Cross, reborn under new names, hidden in Masonic temples and gentlemen's clubs, fell apart as members accused one another of being his hands. No one could tell who was loyal, who was corrupted, or who was simply afraid. The paranoia became. By the turn of the century, Samuel Conincade had become more than legend. He had become a template. Government officials, curious and terrified, began quietly studying the patterns he left behind. Deaths, disappearances, silent collapses of authority. They cataloged them, dissected them, and began asking a dangerous question. Could this method be replicated? A series of secret programs emerged, hidden beneath innocuous names. Bureau of Record Control, Civil Stability Project, Psychological Compliance Initiative. No one outside these circles knew their purpose, but the instructions were clear. Manipulate perception, destabilize authority subtly, and use fear as a tool stronger than chains or bullets. It was a direct inheritance from Samuel. They studied his precision, how he never touched, yet always influenced, how he didn't attack, yet always eliminated, how he exploited the weaknesses of men, the rhythm of systems, the blind spots of institutions. And they learned that visibility is weakness. The moment power sees you, you are no longer unstoppable. Samuel had known this instinctively. They would codify it. At first, they tested on isolated communities. Officials reported towns where elected leaders vanished, where banks balanced themselves in inexplicable ways, where panic spread faster than rumor. Each incident was logged meticulously, analyzed, and then erased from public records. A single principle emerged. Fear, precise and invisible, could shape reality. By 1905, the methods had evolved into bureaucratic warfare. Agencies didn't need soldiers. They didn't need guns. They needed knowledge, patience, and the manipulation of perception. Entire departments were trained in techniques inspired by Samuel. Observation without interaction, control without confrontation, collapse without evidence. And through it all, the legend of the deadliest slave remained the silent tutor. Samuel Conincade's genius had been overlooked for decades by those who only saw chains. Samuel Conincade, the man who had walked through chains, plantations, and battlefields, now existed mostly in shadow. But even shadows have memory. Somewhere in the remnants of Texas, in quiet towns and abandoned homesteads, he watched, not with eyes seeking violence, but with eyes seeking truth. Every ledger, every mismanaged estate, every trembling man who believed he controlled the world had been proof of one immutable law. power belongs only to those who understand its subtleties. He did not rejoice in death. He did not celebrate the collapse of the men who had bought and sold him like livestock. Instead, he observed, with the patience of centuries. He saw the repetition of mistakes, the same arrogance, the same blind faith in control, the same assumption that a system could hold what it had no right to contain. Samuel had learned that freedom was not merely escape from chains. It was mastery of consequence. The men who died under his influence had underestimated the smallest truths. The knowledge that their every weakness was visible, that their every ritual could be studied, and that the human mind, when ignored, becomes predictable. They had forgotten that fear, subtle and invisible, could dismantle authority faster than swords or fire. He became legend, then myth, then instruction. Stories of the Widowmaker, whispered by freedmen, spread to soldiers and then to bureaucrats who never knew his face. His method, calculated observation, precision in timing, psychological manipulation, had transcended him, entering the veins of institutions, the codes of governance, and even the discipline of men who thought themselves untouchable. And yet, Samuel's greatest lesson was not revenge. It was awareness. To see the cracks in a system is to see the limits of power. To understand that control is an illusion is to understand freedom. And he had lived that truth silently, methodically, until the world itself became a canvas for it. He had become the invisible variable. And now, we reach the end of the story, though for Samuel Conningcade there is no end. Only presence, only observation, only the quiet, unyielding truth that power belongs not to those who wield weapons or write laws, but to those who understand systems, patterns, and the fragility of human arrogance. You, sitting there, listening, reading, absorbing, you have already crossed the threshold. You have entered the world where Samuel walked, where men thought themselves masters but were, in fact, exposed in every blind spot of their pride. And here's the truth few ever admit. Once you see the method, once you understand the precision, you can never unsee it. The world itself becomes a series of levers, weaknesses, and shadows waiting to be observed, exploited, and understood. Ask yourself, how many men around you operate under the illusion of control? How many systems you depend on are balanced precariously on mistakes, ignorance, and unseen forces? Samuel Conningcade proved that observation alone is power. That patience alone is dominion. That fear, quiet and invisible, is a weapon sharper than any blade. And perhaps the most chilling revelation is this. Samuel's method did not die with him. It spread. It infected systems, governments, corporations, and even the quiet corners of your own life. Every institution built to enforce authority now carries his imprint, whether anyone admits it or not. Fear, strategy, observation, these are the tools he mastered. And now, they are yours to understand. If you are ready to awaken, to truly see, remember the phrase we asked you to write before. Type it again. Type it twice. I see the silence. Let it sink in. Let it remind you that knowledge is power, and power, when unseen, is unstoppable. Let it transform the way you perceive control, over systems, over men, over yourself. Samuel Conningcade will not walk into your life physically, but if you understand him, you'll feel his presence everywhere authority pretends to exist.